what's interesting is one of the things I say about the brain all the time is nothing happens in isolation. And what I mean by that is every single neuron in the brain connects with up to over 1,000 other neurons. So each connection in the brain isn't one isolated connection, but there's spindles coming off of it that connect with many, many, many other areas. So when you
Awekenge, this is Mental Meters, hosted by Asego Toto.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Mental Meters. I'm your host, Asego Toto. And before we dive into today's incredible conversation, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy what you hear today, please take a moment to rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also helps others discover the valuable insights we share every week. And if you find today's episode particularly inspiring or insightful, don't forget to share it with your friends, family, or anyone you think could benefit from it. Thank you for your support. It truly means the world to us. Now, let's get back into our conversation.
We all know that the brain is the control center of everything that we do. But how exactly does it influence our mood, our ability to focus, and even overall sense of well-being?
So our brain is how we take in and respond to information in our world and our environment. So if there's any disruption or dysregulation in the way our brain takes in, processes, and responds to information, it changes how we're interacting with the world. So one example could be what we see is with many people that struggle with anxiety, often there's aspects of processing that are disrupted. So maybe the way they're perceiving noise or even the way they're perceiving auditory information, if that's disrupted, now your body has a harder time trusting the information that I'm receiving. And so if I'm somebody that gets really stressed in social situations and I'm trying to follow along and keep up with the conversation, but I know that I miss bits and pieces of what's being said, that's going to change how I feel about those social interactions. And so when we're able to trust the information that our brain is giving us, that's one element and one way that helps our mood and energy relax to be able to enjoy the process. And something that's been really interesting to me that I'm seeing coming out in the research is there's an overlap between many different mental health conditions and other challenges such as ADHD. There are similar networks and pathways in the brain involved with depression and ADHD, with anxiety and ADHD. So just because you have ADHD doesn't mean that you're also going to struggle with depression and anxiety, but there is a much higher likelihood. So we see some challenges in some of the similar networks and pathways.
And you spoke about ADHD and mental health. You're in depression, and there's this thing of being neurodivergent. It's something that firstly I saw it's on TikTok and didn't understand it. What is that? And whereas the person that was doing the TikTok was explained it what actually does, and I was a bit surprised. There's a such thing as having two mental health disorders. So in terms of that, how can you, in a way, can you elaborate in terms of how does the brain, I would say, create the okay, let me rephrase my question. Would you say that those neural pathways how can I put this question actually? Okay, let's just leave the thing of neurodivergent.
I think I get what you're going at. Are you asking the question of how is it that the brain can have two separate conditions at the same time?
Yes. Actually, that's my question.
Perfect. So what's interesting is one of the things I say about the brain all the time is nothing happens in isolation. And what I mean by that is every single neuron in the brain connects with up to over 1,000 other neurons. So each connection in the brain isn't one isolated connection, but there's spindles coming off of it that connect with many other areas. So when you have a complication in one area, let's say it's attention and focus, you struggle to sustain attention for a long period of time. Those very networks and pathways, those neurons involved in impulse control and sustained attention, are also connecting to other neurons that impact other areas of development and other areas of function. So, one of the things that I've always seen, and I saw this with parents before I truly understood the neurology, is if a parent reached out to Brain Balance saying, my child struggles with something. My child struggles with emotional regulation. They melt down and are upset far too easily. I would say, and what else is going on? And they would call because of the one main concern that was causing stress or disruption for that child or family. But it was never just one isolated concern. They'd say, well, yeah, they also struggle to stay on task, or they need a lot of prompts and reminders, or they struggle to follow multi-step directions. And I just saw this pattern of never did a challenge exist in isolation. And then I started to see that trend in research as well, where if you do have one condition, whether it's ADHD or a mental health condition, there's a higher likelihood of what's called comorbidity, meaning more than one thing happening at the same time. And it's because of those neurons that connect, they have so many far reaching connections. And so when you've got disruption in one set of neurons, it's going to disrupt and interfere with all of the other neurons it connects with as well.
That's fascinating. And uh, seeing you, watching you as you explained and answered my question, and a question on my mind popped. What would you say that you always had love on the brain, being a, what intrigued you, what interested you of or on the brain health industry?
I first really got involved because I wanted to know the answers to the whys. Before I got involved with Brain Balance, I've always enjoyed neurology information to understand what's happening in the brain. So if I'm having a bad day, if I'm in a bad mood, and there's nothing that I can point my finger to, there's times where I can point my finger. I'm in a bad mood because my kids made a mess in the kitchen and didn't clean up the mess. Some days you wake up and there's nothing that you can point to, but you feel different. And to me, neurology is helping to understand why I'm able to do the things I do, why some things are harder for me than others. And then the more I started learning about it, to realize and understand that it can be influenced and changed. So if I have a hard time sustaining attention and blocking out distractions, I don't have to live my life that way. There are things that I can do to exercise those networks and pathways so that they're more effective. And I think a great way to understand this is if you think about yourself of, if you wake up on a Tuesday morning and you were well rested and low stress and you're excited about what you're working on, you can wake up in a great mood with great energy and you can sit down and work and be really productive. But then if you have another day, let's say it's the same week, a couple days later, and you didn't sleep well at all the night before, you don't have any groceries at home, so you don't eat breakfast that morning, and now you've got a massive work project due and you don't know how to get started. Even though it's the same environment, same person, same house, when our brain is tired, we have a harder time utilizing the functions that already exist. When we're hungry, if our brain does not have the energy it needs to support the workload that we're giving it, You have a hard time. So think about yourself if you're hangry. If you're really hungry, you have a hard time making a decision. You might have a hard time even deciding what it is that you want to eat. You're so hungry, you can't make a decision. You can't think, you can't plan. So, and stress does the same thing. When you're feeling really overwhelmed with stress, it takes away our resources to sustain attention and perform. So, what's interesting to me about neurology is understanding how the same brain in different circumstances can perform in different ways. And then, how can I empower myself with that information? So, if I wake up and I'm stressed and overwhelmed and in a negative mood, what do I have the power to do in that moment to influence how my day is going to go? And what can I do as a parent for my kids or for myself to make changes, small changes over time that's going to strengthen those pathways that support our abilities and productivity? So to me, knowing that challenges can have an explanation and that there's a path to influence them made me excited.
And also it goes with that thing. Everything happens for a reason. I believe that. I always believe that everything happens for a reason. And you mentioned the brain balance, and some people, there's this thing of saying that when it comes to mental health in general, having, for example, depression, people will have this thing of say, I've met different people of my years of doing this podcast. People have different perspective when it comes to mental health in general. The cause of mental health. Some people say the way you were raised. Some people say that the way it is the chemical imbalance of the brain. So how does would you say which side are you in terms of as someone who is a brain health expert?
So to me, brain health is mental health. The state of our brain determines our mood, our emotions, our productivity, our ability. And what influences our brain health is a lot of environmental factors. It's what we eat on a daily basis, it's exercise, it's minimizing inflammation, it's getting sensory exposure so that our brain is accurately taking in information. And something that's been really interesting to me to watch play out over the last several years is this evolution in thinking and approach to brain health and mental health. I think we're talking about mental health in a much more open, collaborative way, which I think is so necessary and so important. And Dr. Thomas Insel is the former director of the National Institute for Mental Health in the United States. And he had a call out several years ago to the professionals in his field, kind of saying, wake up, we need to do better in supporting mental health, where there have been massive changes and advancements in diagnosing and treating cancer, in heart disease, in autoimmune, in all these different areas of health and medicine and science. There have been massive changes and strides and advancements in how we treat and support those conditions. And there haven't been that same degree of strides and improvement in mental health. And he did a talk, he did one at Stanford, he did a TED talk, and in it, he was saying, we need to look at the networks and connections and pathways in the brain. We have neglected to look at this from a brain network perspective, and we need to understand the differences in connectivity with different mental health conditions and what we can do to address and understand that connectivity. And so he was really challenging the mental health profession here in the United States to change their paradigm. And I think all too often we stay really focused in the one niche or area that we're working in. And so if we're working in strategies that people can implement for mood and emotions, we're focused on that instead of taking a step back to say, how do all of these pieces fit together to benefit the whole?
And it, when you spoke about diagnosis, and my mind quickly went to the autism spectrum, and as last month was Autism Awareness Month, and I work in here at Nyasamandu University in the Department of Disability, whereas we assist students when it comes to disability. One of our missions is to create an awareness about different types of disability. Either neuro disability or physical disability. So the documentary that we watched, actually it was just a snippet, a different key, whereas it spoke about autism, whereas the reporter said that mentioned something fascinating, where he said that there is something that people don't. I would say that doctors have this thing of not diagnosing people correctly when it comes to autism. As, for example, when it comes to people of color, they categorize the diagnosis on a white male. So, what would you say that what in what way do you think that they, in terms of how can I put this in terms of what would you say the reason behind of misdiagnosing someone with something?
I think this is such an important question because a diagnosis carries so much power and so much weight in good ways and in negative ways. I always want to define the person and get to know the person based on the person, not the label or the diagnosis. But there are times when a label or diagnosis can be helpful. In the United States, in order to get support services in schools, you need a diagnosis. So, and there are times when a diagnosis gives you a frame of reference to say, okay, I know some challenges, potential challenges, and some potential strengths. But I think we need to do a better job in objective criteria and objective measures for diagnosing ADHD and autism. Where right now, when you look at a lot of the criteria, a lot of it is very subjective. And so a lot of it is done off of parent intake surveys. And so parents are answering questions about their child. And clearly, a parent knows more about their child than anybody else, but they may not have the perspective of if you're a parent of 10 kids, you've seen what development looks like firsthand in 10 different kids. Not all parents have that perspective. So there's really interesting work being done right now in looking at simple objective ways to have an accurate diagnosis sooner. I know one company has an FDA approved diagnostic where they're able to leverage information and trends of information to identify concerns sooner. There's another company that's looking at biomarkers and eye movements. So differences in eye movements to identify developmental concerns early, accurately, and objectively. And I think what's so important about this is you touched on lack of diagnosis, underdiagnosis in different populations. So in individuals of color, in individuals of lower socioeconomics. And oftentimes what we see is there can be less access to care and resources. And so we need to make sure that the diagnostic pieces that we're building to rely on are affordable and accessible. So a functional MRI is great information. It's $1,500 at a minimum. It's not always covered by insurance. And it's not easy to schedule an appointment or get a referral to do that. And so we need accessible, reproducible measurements so that we can capture this information more broadly and in more communities.
And I agree with you. When it comes to mental health, it's one of those fields that it's just ignored. It's like that middle child. They we jokes around. It's just that middle child that is ignored, and as much as we cry out in terms of advocating for mental health and doing this type of podcasting, learning and allowing people to learn, I feel like that's where we can do our part, because what I've seen that is the same thing towards government. They are not. I would say they are not willing to invest in mental well-being because, in a way, would say that it doesn't bring money in some sense. It doesn't contribute to the GDP of the countries. And yeah, I feel like in terms of mental health, it's just under budgeted, and or they receive low income. And one of the things that I'm thinking of doing is fighting that fight in terms of how can we influence governments to fund mental health institutions, in a way that everyone will have access, no matter their skin color, no matter their race, no matter the background they come from. So we mentioned children, and I would like to just ask in terms of brain development, as you mentioned that brain development. What are some biggest challenges children face when it comes to the brain development and mental well-being?
But before I get into I have to reiterate what you said. That's such an important fight to bring awareness and support to the government, because focusing on the GDP and saying that mental health does not have a direct impact on that, so we don't have funding for it, to me is a really short-sighted view and approach. Mental health is all of us. All of us have brain health and mental health. And there are times when there are brain health and mental health crises, but understanding that our ability to be productive, our ability to learn, apply it, and have executive functions, the things that we need to be successful in work and relationships, to generate products that can be sold to other companies that can ultimately impact the environment or impact the economy, comes back to brain health and mental health. So to me, it is so tremendously important that we invest in this. And I'll tie this into the child question and we need to invest in this for everybody from day one. I think what we know is when there are developmental delays, there are gaps and complications. So if a child has a developmental delay, everything in development is a trajectory. So each thing starts and builds to become more complex. If you think about an infant, they start by learning to lift up their head, and then they roll and sit and crawl. Movement starts simple, development starts simple, and over time it builds in complexity. If we have developmental delays, we're not getting that continued development and complexity. And being able to sustain attention, block out distractions, regulate my mood and emotions when I'm upset or angry or confused takes complexity. It takes many aspects of the brain working together. So to me, there's nothing more important than investing in the development and well-being of our kids so that we're optimizing development from early on. And the wonderful thing is, two of the biggest drivers of brain health and development is our sensory system and our physical activity. Those are things that don't take a lot of money or don't take fancy gear and equipment to stimulate and engage. But we need to be aware and we need to be intentional about working those things in. So when we're thinking about early kids in school, it's not just about teaching them letters and numbers and math and reading. It's teaching them what is brain health. Brain health is making sure that we're getting physical activity. It's being aware of what we're eating. And setting our kids up for success from day one helps to build a brain that is more capable and more resilient.
And in the perspective of adults, how do these challenges differ?
The challenges are often the same. They just look different at different ages. So it used to be thought of when we would talk about ADHD. ADHD used to be described as a childhood disorder. It's now been relabeled as a lifespan disorder. It used to be believed that that was something that you outgrew. But what we see in diagnostic imaging is that the brain structure, doesn't change over time. Adults might get better at working around their challenges. So if you really struggle with organization and productivity, maybe you learn that you need to use Post-it notes as constant reminders. You need to write things down. You need an alarm going off to remind you to stop what you're doing to get on to the next task. So as adults who have been facing these same challenges for a long time, we're more aware of what the challenges are, so we could put strategies in place to work around the challenges. But each time I have to apply a workaround strategy, it's taking more energy and effort. If I could just remember something without having to do an alarm and a Post-it note and a calendar piece, I could do it with greater ease and efficiency, which gives my brain more room to do more. So adults often it's often the same challenges, but they're more aware and have more strategies. But it doesn't mean it doesn't take a toll on the brain. And when the brain is tired and fatigued, the brain is negative. So when you're having to work harder to do the same thing, it doesn't mean that you're not capable, that you're not brilliant, but it's going to take a larger toll on you than somebody that isn't facing that same challenge or struggle.
And in terms of, I believe that I agree with you with that. In terms of when the brain is tired, sometimes we cannot fully, I would say not fully allow the brain to operate in a way of tiredness. And I've seen it upon myself in terms of doing a lot of things during the day, having two jobs, doing this and also having a job on the side, and also and academics at another side. So it is really rough. And also I have seen that sleep has a very impact on that of having a better mental well-being. So my question is going to say, how much sleep do we need for optimal brain function, and what are some tips to getting better sleep? As science proven that, I would say science proven that we need 8 hours of sleep.
Yeah. For people that struggle with sleep, I never want to minimize it. If you struggle with sleep, that is such a hard thing because it has such an impact on your day in life. Good sleep hygiene for an adult, we really do want 8 hours of sleep. There was a fascinating study from Cambridge Brain Sciences several years ago, and they looked at mild sleep deprivation and saw the impact of mild sleep deprivation on our cognitive functions, our attention, our memory, our reasoning was equivalent to being mildly intoxicated. So being tired can have the same impact on cognition as having too many cocktails. So it has a very real impact. And I remember feeling that way after our first daughter was born and, months of minimal sleep. I remember saying to my husband one day, I feel like I shouldn't even drive a car right now. I just don't feel sharp and capable. And then years later, I saw that study. It was like, I felt that in that moment. So ideally, we really do want 8 hours of sleep. Now, that's a general rule of thumb. There truly are people that function successfully on less sleep, but regardless of who you are, you don't want to go too far below that. I wouldn't recommend dropping below 6 hours. Just there are so many important processes that happen when we sleep. That's when repair, cleanup, and regeneration happens in the brain and body. And our brain consolidates memories. Our brain organizes itself at night when we sleep. So if we're getting disrupted sleep, where we're not falling asleep and staying asleep for long enough, our brain has less time to repair, to clean up, to regenerate, and to organize and consolidate memories. And so we're taking away the opportunity to enhance memory and function when we're getting less sleep. So good sleep hygiene, a couple simple rules of thumb is no technology in the hour before bedtime, going to bed at a consistent time every night, waking up at a consistent time in the morning. We know that blue light triggers melatonin in the brain, so it kind of bright light like a blue sky, a sunny sky tells the brain it's time to wake up. And so then that sets what time the hormones and chemicals shift in our body to tell our brain it's time to go to sleep. So those set consistent patterns are helpful. And putting the technology away an hour before bedtime has two positive impacts. Number one, when we're scrolling technology, it's so easy to lose track of time. And now I stayed up an hour later than I intended, doing nothing productive. But then it's also emitting that blue light that's signaling to your brain it's time to be awake. And so when you're scrolling, even if it feels mindless and you're tired, it can actually disrupt the hormones and chemicals that are going to help you get good quality sleep. Right?
And the reason, actually, the reason why I asked the question, as I mentioned, that I have difficulty when it comes to sleep. Even when I try by any means to sleep early, there's this thing of not being able to sleep. At some point, I have even tried using the rain sounds for me in order to get proper sleep. Sometimes I can just sleep at early, even at night, like late. I need something that will help me in terms of sleeping. How can people, what in a way, people who are experiencing that also, what ways would you say, what strategies would you suggest?
There's different sleep challenges. So there's people that struggle falling asleep at night. There's people that fall asleep just fine, but they wake up in the middle of the night and then they're wide awake for 2 to 3 hours in the middle of the night. There's people that just are groggy and can't wake up in the morning. One interesting strategy that might be different than what you've tried before is taking 2 weeks, and right when you wake up, you want to, within the first few minutes that you wake up, not within the first few minutes of when you get out of bed, but within the first few minutes of when you wake up, you get up and you do a burst of physical exercise for 3 to 5 minutes. You want to spike your heart rate and engage your muscles. So you could, something as simple as keeping a pair of tennis shoes and a jump rope right next to your bed. So the second you wake up in the morning, you just jump rope or do burpees or push-ups. 3 to 5 minutes of spiking your heart rate. Again, that's going to jolt your system awake. It's going to jolt those hormones and chemicals, which then again reset on a system and function. Now, if that's going to make a difference, you really need to do that every day for 2 weeks. If that helps, it'll help. If that's not helping, then that's not the strategy for you. But that could be a strategy that changes that. Another piece is to really think about what you're eating after 2 p.m. We know that consumption of caffeine, for example, has a half-life of 6 hours, which means if I consume caffeine at 6 a.m., by noon, half of that has broken down. So at noon, I still have caffeine 6 hours later active in my system. It's less, but it's still there. So if you're consuming caffeine at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 10 p.m., that caffeine is still active in your body. And some people are much more sensitive to caffeine than others. I'm one that's very reactive and sensitive to caffeine. So for me, if I want to sleep at night at 10, 11 p.m., I cannot have caffeine past noon. I need like 10 hours for caffeine to clear my system. Sugar is another piece that you don't want to have in the several hours before bedtime because of how sugar spikes and crashes and the mechanisms that sugar triggers. So keeping in mind and minimizing, they're thinking about your timing for caffeine and sugar to help the quality of the ability to fall asleep.
You touched a lot, and I feel like in terms of having difficulty in sleeping, I feel like I really need to try it and see how it will help me. But at the same time, there's this thing of consistency. Consistency is very hard when it comes to building new healthy habits, and I'm not promising anything that I will try. I will try it, but I'm not promising that I will be consistent.
I love the honesty, and you're exactly right. And to try something when you're already exhausted is an uphill battle. So here are my brain tips for setting and achieving a goal. you need to keep a reminder in front of you. So you need a post-it note right by your bed to say, if you want to change your sleep, you've got to do this. And there's a quote that I love, and I don't know who said it first, but success is not about what we do sometimes, it's about what we do all the time. And so it is taking those little baby steps. So don't try to change everything all at once. Don't address caffeine and sugar and exercise first thing in the morning. Choose one thing and then give yourself some grace. You know, if you do it 2 days and you forget the next, or you just don't have it in you, it's okay. Progress, not perfection. But no, you might have to give it an extra day on the end. And it's building new habits. And it doesn't mean that you need to do the exercise first thing in the morning forever, but just long enough to see if that makes a difference for you.
Mm. And I just want to say, I'm seeing that we're out of time actually. I just want to say thank you so much for being here and also touching on the brain balance and what new word that I've learned today, commodity. It's a commodity, if I'm not mistaken.